Let's make a tubular knitted keyhole scarf for Barbie and Ken dolls. Here's why I call it a keyhole scarf. This little opening allows one tail to pull through the other so that the scarf stays on the wearer without a knot. My model today is one of the Disney men dolls. He's wearing the really wide version of the scarf. For Barbies, I recommend one half this wide, and both will be included in this video pattern. The human version of this scarf is from my Keyhole Scarf Collection book, which has numerous versions of keyhole scarves. This particular one appears on page 6 and is knitted entirely using the tubular settings on your machine. Before we start, let's go over the tubular settings on several machines. By the way, tubular knitting is sometimes also called circular knitting, and it occurs when one bed knits going one direction, the second bed knits going the second direction, and it really makes a continuous tube of fabric, no seams needed. The Singer Studio Silver Reed instructions are the same for most of their rippers. On the SRP 60 book, they appear on page 26. The actual instructions for the tubular settings occur on the bottom row of the chart. The other two rows are set up, and the chart is really handy, but takes a little bit of getting used to. This is telling you to use the ribber comb. Set the left side lever to the triangle and the selector on the dial to this setting. Here's what that looks like in real life on the main bed. On the ribber, we changed the left hand 0-1 slider to 0. While setting up, we've had the racking lever set on H. We change it to P now. Here's how the ribber carriage looks in real life. And here's the PH lever set to P. To get a brother to do the same thing, we use one part button on each carriage, and those buttons should be on the opposite sides of the two carriages. Racking is also to P on brother. On Superbas, use both circular arrow keys. On Passives, use CX, CX. Also, we need the stitch sizes to match on both carriages, but that is the stitch sizes on the actual fabric. On Superbas and Passives, very likely it is the same size on the dial. On Japanese machines, very likely it is not. It's likely to be 2 sizes smaller on the ribber. The only way to be really certain is to practice with your particular machine, making a tube and seeing what comes out right. Target gauge is 7 stitches 10 rows per inch using a number 1 or 2 yarn. To be inclusive of new knitters, I'm going into the setup process in some detail, and I'm going to suggest that you begin in waste yarn and bind off both ends after the work is off of the machine so as to get knitting your tube smoothly without putting the main yarn at risk. For the demo, I'm using 20 stitches on each bed. For the slimmer version, for Barbie, use only 10 on each bed. We begin racked to H so that all the needles will pass one another when all come out. With waste yarn in a very small stitch size, knit across. A zigzag row will form. Hang the ribber comb in that zigzag row and place a weight on it. Make the changes to the carriage settings that we already discussed. Turn it up to the stitch size for the main knitting and begin to knit. A tube will begin to form. You could stick your finger down between the beds, but the stitches are still offset because of being in H. Now that we know everything is knitting all right, we can change to P. If both beds sent needles out in position P, they would jam into each other. So we want to wait till we know everything is working just right. Go to P. Knit a few waste yarn rows just to be safe. Make sure everything's still as it should be. It seems to be doing fine. Now thread up the main yarn. We could knit either tail first, but I suggest we knit the long tail first and make that 130 rows. That sounds like a lot of rows, but that is because the counter is really counting off half rows. We're knitting 65 rows of total length. Now the keyhole. We're going to knit it in 2 halves on half of the existing needles. For me, that's the 10 needles on the right on each bed. And if you were knitting the 10 stitch version, it would only be 5 needles on each bed. So we need to get the other stitches completely out of the way. Holding stitches with the usual method doesn't work as well when you're doing circular tubular knitting. So here what I'm doing is putting the stitches that we want held completely out of work by manually knitting in a sturdy enough piece of yarn that I can use it to tug on later, and placing the needles all the way back into non-working position. I'm using a thicker yarn than I would actually knit on this machine for two reasons. It's strong and it's going to show up really well so that you can see what's happening. Now after this, I still have to be careful, but those needles should be safely held. They should not respond at all when the carriage comes across. It's super important that they be all the way back against the rail. And of course these tails must be tucked out of the way. Now we'll knit 20 rows, beginning very slowly to make sure that all is well, and it seems to be. After a couple of rows, the ribber comb is going to stop working as well, and we're going to need to help it along by adding some weight to these stitches only. I use the heavy forks that I show you how to make in my Cool Tools and Cheap Tricks book. Passive heel grips also work well. If all you have to work with is claw weights, use several because they aren't really as heavy or effective. Snip the main yarn, leaving a tail. Set the carriage so that it won't knit at all and move it across to the other side so we can knit the second half of the keyhole. We want to use the yarn that held the stitches to return the stitches to their original needles. It's surprisingly easy. Pull on one of the tails, lift, give a little flick of the wrist that you will soon learn, and usually they pop right back on. Every now and then one needs a little bit of help. You need not lower your beds to do this. I only did so that you'd get a better view of the stitches popping back onto the needles. And obviously the ones from both beds need to go back onto their needles. So now you do the ribber bed. Even up all the needles so they're properly in working position. And what you see here is my yarn is multi-stranded and one of the strands got caught and I'm fixing it. The right needles have no further need for the extra weight. I will now move it to just beneath the left needles. Now we'll put the right hand set of needles, half of the total, whether it's 5 or 10, or if you're making a human scarf, it will be many more, into hold in the same manner that we used to hold the left set. Thread the machine with main yarn again, and again, knit 20 counter rows, really 10 total rounds, on the few stitches that are working. Now return the right half of stitches to work just as we did with the left ones. The keyhole is complete and it's now time to knit the second tail of the scarf, the shorter one. To do that, we'll knit 60 rows on the counter. Again, that's really only 30 total length. You should still be in tubular settings, but just make sure and knit those rows. When they are complete, change back to waste yarn and scrap off. That means knit several rows of waste yarn, break the yarn, and just knit it right off the machine. We don't have to bind off the waste yarn because it's only holding stitches. It'll just be there a few minutes. We do want to bind off all the live stitches at both ends of the scarf. Any bind off that you like is really acceptable, but I'm going to suggest that beginners start by back stitching all the way around the tube and then sewing the tube shut. Backstitch works like this. Come up 2 stitches away from where you last were, then back up and go down into the stitch that you skipped. And the stitches are like half rounds. Up, go back and down, come up, go back and down. Each stitch will then get worked into twice. It's very easy to control the tension. You don't want to either pull the fabric in or stretch it out. Just work all the way around the tube in this manner. Tug on the end of the waste yarn and it will unravel and you can just free it from your bind off. Now simply sew the 2 layers of the tube together, making sure that you orient them so as to keep the slit that we made for the keyhole centered. Pull all the yarn tails to the inside of the tube We don't want the tails at the beginning and ending of the keyhole to lend length to the nearby stitches so they grow and become sloppy. So work them so they can come out of the same piece of knitting, tie them loosely together, and then pull the knot back inside the tube far enough it disappears and snip off the tails. A couple of notes before I go. This is how much weight I used that was successful on this machine with river combination. And item number 2, I only designed these for adult sizes and doll sizes. The reason being that I think they are dangerous for small children. That keyhole closure is too secure and could conceivably cause strangulation if a child was in an accident in the playground, and I just won't design them for that reason.